Hi, this is Cody from The Negative Maps. Today we are reading Chapter 3 of Lacan's Freud's Papers on Technique, Seminar 1. Chapter 3 is Resistance and the Defenses. In the last seminar's chapter, we had just read through Lacan's interventions and responses to the presentations from participants during the seminar and to Jean Hippolyte. Continuing on, Lacan will tell us more about the reports, the presentations provided by Manoni and Anzieu. We'll respond a little bit more to Hippolyte and talk much more on this notion of the resistance and of the defenses of the ego and in analysis. Let us first congratulate Manoni and Anzieu on their reports, which have the merit of showing us the controversial aspects of the question we are dealing with, as is appropriate to minds well educated, but only recently initiated into. If not the application of analysis, at least its practice, there was in their report something quite sharp, even polemical, which is always of value in revealing the problem's vividness. A very delicate question has been raised, all the more delicate since, as I pointed out in my interruptions, it is very much of a present concern for some of us. A reproach has implicitly been levelled at Freud, as to his authoritarianism, alleged to be constitutive of his method from the beginning. That is paradoxical. If anything constitutes the originality of the analytic treatment, it is rather to have perceived at the beginning, right from the start, the problematical relation of the subject to himself. The real find, the discovery, in the sense I explained to you at the beginning of this year, is to have conjoined this relation with the meaning of symptoms. It is the subject's refusal of this meaning that poses a problem for him. This meaning must not be revealed to him, it must be assumed by him. In this respect, psychoanalysis is a technique that respects the person, in the sense in which we understand it today, having realized that it had its price. Not only respects it, but cannot function without respecting it. It would thus be paradoxical to place in the foreground the idea that analytical technique has its aim to break down the subject's resistance, which isn't to say that the problem doesn't ever arise. Indeed, aren't we aware these days that an analyst doesn't make a single move in the treatment without teaching his students to be always asking themselves, in relation to the patient, the question, what defense has he come up with now? This isn't really a policeman's approach, in the sense that it involves looking for something hidden. That term should rather be reserved for the suspect phases of analysis in its archaic periods. Rather, they are always trying to find out what posture the subject could possibly take up, what find he could have made, in order to get himself into a position such that everything we might say to him will be ineffective. It would not be fair to say that they impute bad faith to the subject, because bad faith is too much tied to the implications of the order of knowledge, which are totally foreign to the state of mind. That would be too subtle by half. There is in all of this the idea of the subject's fundamental ill will. All these features lead me to think that I am being accurate in calling this style of analysis inquisitorial. Before going into my subject, I will take as an example Margaret Little's article on Counter Transference, which appeared in the first number of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis for 1951. This article takes its bearings from a manner of orienting technique which is pushed very far by a certain section of the English school. As you know, it leads to the view that the whole of analysis must unfold in the hic et nunc. Everything is supposed to take place through grappling with the subject's intentions, here and now, in the session. That one catches glimpses of bits and pieces of his past is no doubt conceded, but it is thought that in the end it is in the trial. I was about to say the trial of psychological strength, within the treatment that the entire activity of the analyst is deployed. Sorry, I think I got the Latin wrong there. It says HICETNUNC, which I pronounced hic et nunc, but that sounds ridiculous, so don't trust me on that at all. And that really is the problem. The activity of the analyst. How does he act? And what are the implications of what he does? For the authors in question, for Margaret Little, nothing else matters but the recognition by the subject. That phrase again, hic et nunc, of the intentions of his discourse. And his intentions only ever have value in their implications, hic et nunc, in the immediate exchange. The subject may well describe himself taking on the grocer or the hairdresser. In fact, he is bawling out the person he's talking to, that is to say, the analyst. There is some truth in that. The slightest experience of conjugal life will tell you that there is always an implicit demand of some sort in the fact that one spouse relates to the other what got his goat during the day, rather than the other way around. but it may also stem from a concern to inform the other of some incident worth knowing about. Both are true. It is a question of knowing on which aspect one should throw some light. As the following story told by Margaret Little shows, things do sometimes go even further. Certain of its features are a bit confused, but everything points to the fact that it is a training analysis, or in any case, the analysis of someone whose area of interest is very close to psychoanalysis. The analysand had occasion to make a radio broadcast on a topic that intensely interested the analyst himself. These things happen. It so happened that he gave this broadcast a few days after his mother's death. Now everything points to the fact that the mother in question plays an extremely important role in the patient's fixations. He is certainly very affected by this mourning, but he nonetheless fulfills his obligations in a particularly brilliant manner. The next session, he arrives in a state of stupor close to confusion. Not only is it impossible to get anything out of him, but what he does say is surprising in its lack of coordination. The analyst interprets boldly, "You are in this state because you think I greatly begrudge you from your success on the radio the other day, with this topic which, as you know, personally interests me in the highest degree." There we have it. The rest of the account shows that it took a year for the subject to recover from this shock interpretation, which hadn't failed to have some effect, since he had instantly recovered his spirits. This shows you that the fact that the subject comes out of a confused state of mind following an intervention by the analyst by no means proves that it was effective in the strictly therapeutic, structuring sense of the word, namely that it was, in the analysis, true. On the contrary, Margaret Little brought the subject back to a sense of the unity of his ego. Suddenly he tears himself out of the confusion in which he found himself, saying to himself, "Here is someone who points out to me that indeed everything is much of a muchness and that life goes on." And he starts off, gets going again. The effect is instantaneous. It is impossible in the analytic experience to consider the subject's change of style as being the proof of the correctness of an interpretation. I consider the proof of the correctness of an interpretation to lie in the confirmatory material the subject supplies, and even that needs to be put more subtly. After a year, the subject realizes that his state of confusion was linked to the backlash of his reactions to mourning, which he had only been able to overcome by inverting them. I refer you at this point to the Psychology of Mourning, whose depressive side some of you are sufficiently familiar with. Indeed, a radio talk is produced in accordance with a very specific modality of speech, since it is addressed to a mass of invisible listeners by an invisible speaker. It may be said, in the imagination of the speaker, it isn't necessarily addressed to those who listen to it, but equally to everyone, the living and the dead. The subject there enters into a relationship of conflict. He might regret that his mother was not able to be a witness to his triumph, but perhaps at the same time in the speech which he gave to his invisible listeners there was something that was intended for her. However that may be, the nature of the subject's attitude is then clearly inverted, pseudo-manic, and its strict relation with the recent loss of his mother, privileged object of his bonds of love, is quite clearly the source of the critical state in which he had arrived for the next session. After his exploit, after having accomplished, despite the unpropitious circumstances, and in a brilliant fashion, what he had set himself to do. Thus, Margaret Little, who was however far from having a critical attitude with respect to this style of intervention, herself testifies to the fact that an interpretation based on the intentional signification of the discursive act in the immediate present of the session is subject to all the relativities implied by the possible engagement of the analyst's ego. In a word, the important thing is not that the analyst himself was mistaken, and there's nothing in the slightest to indicate that the counter transference is to be blamed for the interpretation, so clearly refuted by the rest of the treatment. Not only can we concede that the subject had been prey to the feelings that the analyst imputed to him, it is even extremely probable that they led the analyst into giving the interpretation he did isn't something dangerous in itself. If the analysing subject, the analyst, had even felt some jealousy, it is up to him to take into account in an appropriate manner, to be guided by it as by an extra needle on the dial. No one has ever said that the analyst should never have feelings towards his patient, but he must know not only not to give in to them, to keep them in their place, but how to make adequate use of them in his technique. In this particular instance, it is because the analyst thought he should look first in the hic et nunc for the reason for the patient's attitude that he found it in something which, without a shadow of a doubt, really existed in the intersubjective field shared by the two characters. He was well placed to recognize it, because because he felt some hostility, or at the very least irritation in connection with the patient's success. What is serious is to have believed himself authorized by a certain technique to make use of it straight away and in a direct manner. Why do I contrast this two? I will now try and show you. The analyst here believes himself authorized to offer what I will call an interpretation from ego to ego, or from equal to equal. Allow me to play on words. In other words, an interpretation whose foundation and mechanism cannot in any way be distinguished from that of projection. When I say projection, I am not saying erroneous projection. Let there be no mistake what I am explaining to you. Before I became an analyst, I had, thanks to what little psychological gifts I have, taken a formula as the principle of the little compass with which I appraised some situations. I was quite happy to say to myself, feelings are always reciprocated. It is absolutely true, appearances notwithstanding. As soon as you put two subjects together, I say two, not three, feelings are always reciprocated. This explains why the analyst was justified in thinking that given that he had these particular feelings, corresponding feelings could be elicited in the other. The proof of it is in their wholehearted acceptance by the other. All that would be necessary is for the analyst to tell him, you are hostile because you think that I am irritated with you. And the feeling would be elicited. The feeling then was already virtually, since all that was required for it to exist was the light, the blue touch paper. The subject was perfectly justified in accepting Margaret Little's interpretation for the simple reason that, in a relationship as intimate as that which exists between analyst and analyst, he was sufficiently aware of the analyst's feelings to be induced into something symmetrical. The question is to know whether this way of understanding the analysis of defences doesn't land us with a technique which almost inevitably generates a specific sort of error, an error which in fact isn't one, something prior to truth and falsity. There are interpretations which are so to the point and so true, so necessarily to the point and true, that one cannot say if they do or do not speak to a truth, whichever way they will be verified. It is best to abstain from offering this interpretation of the defense, which I will call from ego to ego, whatever value it may eventually have. In the interpretation of defenses, there should always be at least a third term. In fact, you need more than that. And I hope to be able to give it and to prove it to you. But I am only opening up the problem today, too. It is which will not allow us to go as far as I would have liked into the problem of the relation between resistance and the defences. Nevertheless, I would like to give you some sense of where we're heading. After having listened to Manoni and Anziu's reports, and after having shown you the risks run by a particular analytic technique, I think it necessary to lay down some guidelines. It is in the interpretation of dreams that Freud offered the first definition, in relation to analysis of the notion of resistance. In Chapter 7, Section 1, there is this decisive sentence, Was immer der Fortsearbeit stört, ist ein Wildstand, which means everything which destroys, suspends, or changes the continuation of the work. Symptoms are not at issue here. What is in the analytic work? The cure, the Behandlung, as we say when dealing with an object undergoing certain processes. Everything which destroys the continuation of the work is a resistance. This has been unhappily translated into French as tout obstacle à l'interprétation pour la résistance psychique. Whatever interrupts the progress of analytic work is a resistance, or every obstacle to interpretation stems from psychical resistance. I am pointing this out to you because it doesn't make life easy for those who can only go by the very congenial translation of the brave M. Mayus, and the whole of the preceding paragraph is translated in some vein. This should instill in you a healthy suspicion of a number of translations of Freud. In the German edition, a note is added to the sentence quoted, which discusses the following point. If the patient's father dies, is it a resistance? I am not going to tell you what conclusion Freud reaches, but you see that this note shows how broadly the question of resistance is conceived. Well, this note is omitted in the French edition. Everything which suspends, destroys, interrupts the continuity, Fortsetzung, can even be translated like that. Of the cure is a resistance. You must start from texts such as these, mull them over a bit, sift them, and see where it gets you. What does all this add up to? What is at issue is the continuation of treatment, of the work, in order to make it perfectly unambiguous. Freud did not say Behandlung, which would mean the cure. No, what is at issue is work, Arbeit. or Ab, which can be defined by its form as the verbal association determined by the rule which he has just mentioned, the fundamental rule of free association. Now this work, since we are dealing with the analysis of dreams, is quite clearly the revelation of the unconscious. This will allow us to consider a certain number of problems, in particular the one which Andrew mentioned just now, the resistance. Where does it come from? We've seen that none of the texts in the Studien über History allows one to suppose that as such it comes from the ego, nor does anything in the Traumdeutung indicate that it comes from the secondary process, whose introduction is such an important stage in the development of Freud's thought. When we get to the years around 1915, when Freud published Der Verdrängung, the first of these studies to appear amongst those which were eventually to be regrouped into the metapsychological writings, resistance is indeed conceived of as something produced on the side of consciousness, whose identity is essentially determined by its distance, Entfernung, from what was originally repressed. The relation, then, of resistance to the contents of the unconscious itself is, in this instance, still extremely tangible. It will remain so right up to a period later than of this article, which belongs to the middle period of Freud's development. What is it, in the end, which has been primarily repressed? From the interpretation of dreams up to this period which I call intermediary, it is still, as always, the past. A past which must be reinstated, and whose ambiguity we cannot but recall once again, no less than the problems that it raises as to its definition, its nature, and its function. This period is the same as that of the Wolfman, in which Freud raises the question, what is a trauma? He realizes that trauma is an extremely ambiguous concept, since it would seem that, according to all the clinical evidence, its fantasy aspect is infinitely more important than its event aspect. Whence the event shifts into the background in the order of subjective references. In contrast, the dating of the trauma remains for him a problem that he sees fit to retain quite, if I may put it this way, pig-headedly, as I reminded those of you who followed my course on the subject of the Wolfman, who will ever know what he saw. But whether he saw it or not, he can only have seen it on a specific date. He cannot have seen it were it only 1 year later. I don't think I am being unfaithful to Freud's line of thought. All you need to know is how to read him. It's written down in black and white, by saying that it is only the perspective of history and of recognition that allows a definition of what counts for the subject. For those of you who aren't familiar with this dialectic, which I have already developed at great length, I would like to offer a certain number of basic concepts. One should always work at the level of the alphabet. I am therefore going to take an example which will make you understand clearly the questions raised by recognition, and which will keep you from drowning it in notions as confused as those of memory and recollection. If Erlebnis in German can still have a meaning, the French notion of a memory that is lived or not lived leads to all sorts of ambiguities. I'm going to tell you a little story. I wake up in the morning with my curtain, like Semiramis, and I open one eye. I don't see this curtain every morning because it's the curtain of my house in the country, where I go only every week or so. And among the lines fermented by the fringe of the curtain I notice once again, I have only ever seen it once like that in the past, the silhouette of a face, all at once, sharp, edged, caricatured and old-fashioned, which for me is vaguely like the face of an 18th century marquis. This is one of those completely stupid fabulations to which the mind lends itself when waking, produced as a result of Gestalt-like crystallization. As one would say these days, in speaking of the recognition of a figure one has known for a long time. The same thing could have happened with a spot on the wall. That's why I can say that the curtain hasn't moved an inch since precisely 8 days before. A week ago, on waking up, I had seen the same thing. I had, of course, completely forgotten it. But it is because of that I know that the curtain hasn't moved. It is still there, in exactly the same position. This is only a fable because it takes place on the imaginary plane, although it wouldn't be difficult to put the symbolic coordinates in place. The bits of nonsense, the 18th century marquis, etc., plays a very important part in it. Because if I didn't have a certain number of fantasies on the subject of what the profile represents, I wouldn't have recognized it in the fringe of my curtain. But let's leave that. Let us see what this implies on the plane of recognition. The fact that it really was like that 8 days previously is linked to the phenomenon of recognition in the present. This is exactly the expression that Freud uses in the Studien über History. He recounts having undertaken at this period several studies on memory, and he relates the memory evoked, the recognition, to the actual and present-day force which lends it, not specifically its weight and its density, but quite simply its possibility. This is how Freud proceeds. When he doesn't know which way to turn to elicit the reconstruction of the subject, he takes hold of him then and there, with the pressure of the hands on the forehead, and enumerates all the years, all the months, all the weeks, even all the days, naming them one by one, Tuesday the 17th, Wednesday the 18th, etc. He trusts sufficiently in the subject's implicit structuration by that what has since been defined as socialized time, to think that when his enumeration reaches the point at which the hand of the clock truly intersects with the critical moment of the subject, the latter will say, "Oh yes, that's right, I do remember something for that day." Note that I am not saying that it works. It is Freud who assures us that it did work. Have you got hold of the implication of what I am saying to you? The subject's centre of gravity is this present synthesis of the past, which we call history, and it is in that we trust when it is a matter of keeping the work going. That is what is presupposed by analysis from its beginnings. Henceforth, there are no grounds on which to prove that it is refuted at its end. In truth, if it isn't like that, it is absolutely impossible to see anything novel in analysis. This is a first phase. Is it enough? No, of course it isn't enough. The subject's resistance is no doubt in action on this plane, but it manifests itself in an odd manner which deserves to be explored, and in strictly specific instances. There is one case in which Freud knew the whole story. The mother had told him it, so he tells it to the subject by saying to her, "Here is what happened, this is what was done to you." On each occasion, the patient, a hysteric, responded with a little hysterical crisis, a replica of the characteristic crisis. She listened and replied in her own way, which was her symptom, which raises several small problems, and this one in particular. Is it a resistance? It is a question that I open for today. I would like to conclude with the following remark. At the end of the Studien über History, Freud defines the pathogenic nucleus as what is being sought, but which repels the discourse, what discourse shuns. Resistance is the inflection the discourse adopts on approaching the nucleus. From then on, we will only be able to resolve the question of resistance by deepening our understanding of what is the meaning of this discourse. We have already said it, it is a historical discourse. Don't let's forget what analytic technique is in its beginning, a hypnotic technique. In hypnotism, the subject sustains this historical discourse. He even sustains it in a particularly striking dramatized manner, which implicates the presence of the listener. Once out of this hypnotized state, the subject remembers nothing of this discourse. Why is this precisely the point of entry into the technique of analysis? Because the reviviscence of the trauma is revealed here, in itself, immediately, if not in a permanent therapeutic manner. It turns out that a discourse held like that, by someone who can say, me, moi, concerns the subject. It still is ambiguous to speak of the lived, relived character of the trauma in the second hysterical state. It is not on account of the discourse having been dramatized and presented in a pathetic manner that the word relived does the trick. What does it mean to say that the subject assumes his own lived experience? You see that I am bringing the question to bear at the point where this relived is at its most ambiguous, namely in the subject's second state. But isn't it exactly the same at every level of analytic experience? At every turn we come upon the question, what is the meaning of this discourse which we force the subject to set up within the parenthesis of the fundamental rule? This rule tells him, when all is said and done, your discourse has no importance. As long as he surrenders himself to this exercise, he already only half believes in his discourse, since he knows himself to be in the crossfire of our interpretation at every moment. So the question then becomes, what is the subject of the discourse? That is where we will start off again next time, and we'll try to discuss the meaning and importance of resistance in relation to these fundamental problems. That's the end of section and chapter 3 of seminar 1, Resistance and the Defenses. Next up is chapter 4, the ego and the other, which we'll be reading next time. So, at the end of this resistance and the defenses, what can we say? What has been said? What can be? If you remember earlier towards the opening of this chapter, there was the mentioning of Margaret Little's article specifically on Counter Transference. As we get through this text and through the other seminars of Lacan, we'll notice that Lacan doesn't give much faith to this term of Counter Transference. He actually wants to stick his guns to transference itself. I believe, I could be getting this wrong actually, there's a Freudian text which I believe is called On Transference Love, and I believe I'm saying that, and I believe this is where the term countertransference comes up in Freud, but it's a text specifically on the cases in analysis in which the patient, the analysand, becomes affectionate, infatuated, and loving towards the therapist, towards the analyst. And we call these emotions which elicit in the analysand for the therapist the transference, and typically then the countertransference is the emotions which arise in the analyst, in the therapist, in response. But as we get on, we want to dismiss, as we were approached in the first section of this text, the idea of this two-bodied problem, that there is indeed two egos in the room, the therapist and the patient, or the analyst and the analysand. The analyst representing what we could call the ego to be, the real subject who provides an account of the world which the patient wants to adopt and accept. This is something which Lacan finds horrendous about ego psychology and some of the ongoing practices of psychoanalysis during this time in the 50s. Resistances come up then for him in transference and in countertransference, which he will collapse into what he will call the intersubjective field, the space that represents both the ego of the subject, the ego of the analyst, but also the cultural ego that exists outside of them, what he will come to name the big other. Resistance is that which prevents the continuation of the work, not the cure, but the work. The work being implied in the interpretation of dreams as the unveiling of the unconscious itself, the realization of the unconscious processes, symptoms, and so on and so on. Another quote by Freud is that usually the stronger the interpretation, as has been said here by Lacan, the more accurate, the more true, so to speak, of the interpretation. Freud implies that there is a direct correlation, therefore, with the strength of the resistance received, that the more accurate I provide an account of your unconscious situation, the more resistance you will provide for me in response. So, in the next chapter on the ego and the other, we will look even furthermore into resistance and transference, as well as a couple of concepts which will become very important for Seminar 2 and 3, especially 3, the psychosis, the concept of Verwerfung and Verdrängung. These take further the ideas of repression, but also this Freudian notion of foreclosure, or what Lacan will call foreclosure, which is essential for the distinction between neurosis and psychosis. I'll end the recording here. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed, and I hope you're here for the next reading. Next up, we'll be reading Deleuze's continued What is Grounding and the continued seminars and lectures from Foucault in the Essential Works Volume 1. This has been Cody with our organs. Have a great day.